Well, as you're probably well aware, it is indeed 4th of July weekend, and as you can see, today has a bit of a different feel around here. In fact, this is actually a strategic weekend here at Grumlaw Church where we press pause on our in-person Sunday gatherings in order to give our core group of volunteers some much-needed rest, and we collectively gather together here at our online campus. So wherever you're watching from, maybe your living room, a campsite, an Airbnb that maybe has like a little spotty Wi-Fi, or maybe you're still just laying in bed at home having a bit of a staycation. We are so glad that you decided to carve out some time and spend it here with us. Right now, we are smack dab in the middle of this series titled Upside Down, where we're exploring some statements that come right at the beginning of what is easily Jesus' most famous recorded sermon. It's been dubbed the Sermon on the Mount. These statements, which we find at the beginning of Matthew's gospel account, specifically Matthew chapter 5, they're often referred to as the Beatitudes. And we've learned throughout this series that this term beatitude, in its most literal translation, it would yield us this term in our English language, blessedness, which is why each of these statements begin with the word blessed, or if you grew up going to church, you say blessed. But it's so much more than happiness. It's so much more than favor. It's underscored by God's grace in the life of the believer. That is, you can't experience the blessedness that's being spoken about here apart from Jesus himself. It's something that's reserved for those who earnestly seek him. There is a divine component to the blessedness that Jesus is speaking about. And understanding that's really, really important. Because admittedly, as you read these statements from a strictly worldly point of view, they make absolutely no sense. They seem to be the complete opposite of what we would normally think and what the world would in fact tell us. As the title of this series would suggest, they are very much upside down. Which, by the way, if you're just beginning to explore, you're just kind of beginning to lean into this conversation surrounding Jesus, it is a very important, even foundational truth for you to understand. Most of what Jesus would teach, most of what he would model, most of what he would advocate for goes against our natural instincts. It's the complete opposite of what our world would advocate for, what our world would model, which on the surface, right, that seems a little bit odd, right? I mean, is Jesus just trying to be difficult? Is he being the contrarian just for the sake of being different? That's maybe what our world would attempt to convince us of regarding Jesus, but as it turns out, Jesus is actually just trying to protect us from, well, us, protect us from ourselves. He's trying to protect you from you. See, we find ourselves right now in a cultural moment where personal autonomy is valued above all else. You be you, live and let live. The only problem with that is, and just think about this logically, this isn't a religious thing, this is just a human being thing. The problem with that is that you rarely take you in the right, in the best, in the healthiest direction. Come on, as Jesus so refreshingly points out, with a balance of honesty and trueness that is so rare to find, what comes naturally to you is rarely what is best for you. I mean, isn't it true that what comes natural, your visceral reactions, your initial instincts, that they almost exclusively lead you to shame and regret and guilt and embarrassment? Natural leads you to the brink of despair, and upon your arrival will just leave you there. That natural won't help you out of the mess that you've just created for yourself. I mean, I won't speak for all of you, but natural Shay is short-tempered. He's easily irritated. He wants to sit on the couch and watch TV while my wife Andrea gets the kids ready for bed. Natural, for all of us, it leads to lust over love. It stares too long at the scantily dressed women. Naturally whispers, it's just one more, what's the big deal? Natural overeats and overdrinks and overindulges. Natural says, hey, if you want it, buy it. Pay no attention to the financial ramifications down the road. You deserve it. Come on, there's very little that comes natural to me that is best for me. And maybe more importantly, well, the people around me. So Jesus, he comes along and he invites us to follow him rather than you, rather than me. He knows that you and I, we're not very good masters. And so he extends an invitation to us right on into his upside down kingdom, which which as it turns out isn't really upside down at all. It's actually the original design, the way that life was supposed to be, full of joy and peace and contentment, something that we're all searching for, something that we're all yearning for, the life that God designed for us before sin came along and started wreaking havoc on ourselves and the people around us. That the life, by the way, that God still has waiting for you if you would just stop listening to yourself and instead take your cues from Him. Upside down is actually the life that we live apart from Him, when we continue to be the rulers of our own kingdoms. And Jesus, again, with a refreshing honesty, asks us, hey, how's that working out for you? Come on, you don't have to admit this to anyone else, but you're not very good at this, are you? So Jesus says, hey, why not follow me? Follow me right back into the way it was supposed to be before you started screwing it all up with your I know better posturing. So we've been exploring these upside down statements from Jesus. How do we get in on this divine blessedness that Jesus is speaking of? It's something that each of us are searching for, that each of our souls are yearning for. Well, today we explore Beatitude number 4 of 8. And Jesus would teach us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, that blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, righteousness is one of those words that we see frequently pop up in the pages of Scripture. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount alone, Jesus uses this word 5 different times. But I doubt any of you use that word in everyday conversation. So it's sort of this strange equation. Used frequently in Scripture, never used in everyday conversation, which leads to the fact that few of us actually understand its meaning, or maybe better or more politely stated, few of us have taken the time to understand what that word righteousness actually means. Now, like so many of those intimidating biblical words, it's not hard to figure out the meaning if you just kind of stare at the word for a little bit. In its most simplistic form, righteousness means a right relationship or a right standing. Now, oftentimes in Scripture, it's specifically referring to a right standing or relationship with God Himself. But in this particular instance, when we consider the context of the rest of the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, it's speaking of a right relationship with both God and other people. In other words, Jesus is saying, you will experience abounding joy, peace, and satisfaction as you seek a right relationship with God and others. Now, how do we know this? The Beatitudes that precede and follow give us a clue as to the type of righteousness that Jesus was hinting at. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 7 through 9, we take a peek at the next couple Beatitudes. It says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So how do we seek that right standing, that right relationship with God as well as the people around us? We show mercy, we uphold purity, and we're not simply peaceful. We as followers of Jesus, we are peacemakers. Now, what's interesting is when you think of Jesus' definition or the parameters surrounding righteousness right here in the Beatitudes, is that they actually have very little to do with God, who elsewhere in Scripture is often the subject of righteousness. And here it seems to be far more focused on others. As it turns out, this isn't actually some one-off for Jesus. Jesus went out of his way throughout his time on this earth to make sure that you and I understood that our love for God is best illustrated, demonstrated, and authenticated by your love for other people. But perhaps the most notable example we actually find later on in Matthew's gospel account. For those of you who have been at this church thing for a while, you surely are familiar with this passage of Scripture that we find in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 40. Jesus says here, when the Son of Man, a title that he would often use for himself, comes in all his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, to take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or go to visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Let me read that verse one more time. The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." See, it's sort of like Jesus is saying, whatever you do for others, it's like you're doing it for me. Which again, if you think about this actually in purely human terms, it makes an incredible amount of sense, right? And anyone in particular who has children, you really get this idea. You want to know, actually, the quickest way to get on my bad side? Do something mean, ill-spirited, disrespectful to one of my kids. Nothing will ignite the righteous anger of Shea Prisk faster than if you mess with one of my children. But the opposite also holds true. You want to know the fastest way to get on my good side? To butter me up? Do something kind or loving for one of my children. In fact, my youngest son, Oakley, recently, he was watched by a dear friend in this faith community. And upon picking Oakley up, she immediately took him to a store and literally let him pick out any toy that he wanted. And because he is obsessed with like trucks and construction vehicles, he picked out like this massive excavator that I will just admit I would have never let him purchase. Then she took him to McDonald's and let him, of course, get a Happy Meal. We're more of like the dollar or like buy this thing and you get another thing for $1 family. So that was pretty thrilling. Then she would bring him back to his house and he got to drive a Power Wheel, which, let's be honest, as a child, there is nothing better than driving a Power Wheel. And as she was sending my wife and I pictures throughout the day, I literally thought to myself, good grief, do I love that woman. Remember, human beings are God's most prized possession. He quite literally placed a part of himself inside every one of us. He goes actually out of his way to let us know that he, for instance, has every hair on our heads numbered. He knitted us together in our mother's wombs. We are God's children. So the quickest and the most surefire way to please God or pursue righteousness, be like Christ to one of his kids. Conversely, the quickest way to ignite God's righteous anger, mess with one of his children. Belittle, devalue, gossip about, ignore, to take advantage of one of his children. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. See, when we think about it that way, it shouldn't probably surprise us that Jesus teaches us that the best way to pursue righteousness vertically with God is by pursuing righteousness horizontally, with the you next to you. And according to the righteousness that Jesus speaks about in the Beatitudes, we are to show mercy, uphold purity, and be peacemakers. Let me give us an example maybe from each. You want to know why you shouldn't lose your mind on the person that cuts you off while you're driving? You're like, oh, I think I know the answer to that. Because in the Bible, doesn't it say, thou shalt not get angry? Like there's got to be a rule about that, right? It's like, nope. It's because when you lose it on another person, and in turn, you don't extend mercy, you're showing that individual quite literally the complete opposite picture of Jesus. A person that, oh, by the way, Jesus saw fit to die for. A person created in the image of God. When we're unwilling to extend mercy to a lousy driver, or a coworker, or a boss, or our spouse, or a neighbor, we are actually withholding the very thing that Jesus poured out on the cross. Let's talk about purity. All you non-married dudes, you want to know why you shouldn't pressure females sexually? It's like, oh man, I think I know the answer to this, right? Because like sex is bad, right? Like there's something in the Bible about that. It's like, no, God actually invented sex. It's because when you get someone to do something that he don't want to do, especially as it relates to sexuality, you end up creating a regret for that person. And followers of Jesus, we don't create regrets for our fellow image bearers. And even if it's consensual, when someone thinks about their greatest regret, and unfortunately, it usually has to do with sexuality, they don't think about you. You're not a part of that awkward dance when they do finally meet the person that they're going to spend the rest of their lives with, and they're doing that whole, like, do I tell them everything about my past? And if I tell them everything about my past, are they going to tell me everything about you're not a part of that story. One more. You want to know why? When that friend whose marriage is like really struggling, you don't just merely throw out the token, hey, I'll be praying for you, but instead you insist on watching their kids so that they can have a date. You offer to actually help pay for marriage counseling. You bring them meals unannounced. You call and pray with them like on a daily basis on their commute home at night. It's because you, like Jesus, are a peacemaker. You go out of your way to help create peace in the lives of other people and in turn model beautifully what Jesus did during his time on this earth. Like Jesus, you understand that there's a huge difference between hoping and doing. So you actively take steps to get involved. But blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And oh, by the way, when you begin to pursue righteousness in this way, you'll begin to experience a contentment that previously evaded you. Not only is there rich blessing in the here and the now on this earth, as Jesus says, you will be filled. You get to look forward to the riches of eternity. And if that's still somehow not enough, well, let's return to where we started this conversation today. Hasn't your own life shown you that all this other stuff that we attempt to fill that God-shaped void with, I mean, vacation homes and nicer cars and newer technology and that guy or that girl and sexual fantasies in your career, doesn't all of that always fall short? I mean, for a moment, right, it felt good. But a month goes by and suddenly the boat isn't as, well, cool as you thought it was. You wake up the next morning and regret tends to overwhelm the fun from the night before with him or her. That the financial stress outweighs what's parked in the driveway. There's a reason that all of that never lasts. It's because it's a cheap substitute. It was never meant to last. All of that was never meant to fill that void because it's a void that was always and will forever be intended for Jesus. To return to one of my favorite quotes that we touched on in part 1, our hearts are restless until they can find rest in you. Maybe the reason the grass always looks greener on the other side is because you have yet to devote your life to the single pursuit of righteousness. And maybe you ought to listen to what your life has already clearly demonstrated and shown to you. That all that other stuff will forever and always fall short. See, one of the last things that Jesus says in his Sermon on the Mount, it's a bit alarming. No matter where you find yourself today on this whole faith journey. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, again, he's nearing the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says this, Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I, Jesus says, will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. See, these are people who apparently went to church. They were in small groups. They volunteered. They partook in many religious activities. But the passion, the hunger and thirst for their lives was not righteousness. And therefore, they will not be satisfied, neither in this life or in the age to come. That should probably shake all of us up just a little bit. That you can spend your life doing very religious, seemingly really good things, and yet miss Jesus altogether. Deep and lasting satisfaction for our souls comes not from the delights of the world, nor from a merely religious or even a vertical relationship with God. Satisfaction, contentment, joy, peace, it comes from God to those whose passion in life is to know him in the struggle to be like him in the world. Whatever you do for others, it's like you're doing it for him. So let us be a people who hunger and thirst for righteousness by showing mercy, upholding purity, and by living as peacemakers.